The team has three objectives for today's webinar. One, we will define what a PLC is. Two, we will identify data needed for the PLC process. And three, identify the connection between PLCs and evaluations. All right, Jeremy, take it away.
Thank you very much, Armando. To get us kicked off, we have kind of a icebreaker, if you will, a real short, easy question. I'd love for you to drop your answers in the chat. Now that it's officially October, which candy describes you and your year right now? Is it Airheads? What? It's October? What's even happening right now? Is it a Jawbreaker? I'm trying. It's good, but I could crack it any second. Is it Smarties? Maybe not the best, but it's running pretty smooth. Or is it a chocolate bar? How could it possibly be going any better? Drop your answer in that chat. Let's see how y'all are doing. D, Smarties. I like that. A couple B's. You know, the Jawbreaker is a common thread in some Smarties. That's good. Chock full of nuts. I like that, Elizabeth. I need to add that for the next time I ask this question. Very good. It seems like the middle of the road there, Jawbreakers and Smarties, is winning the day. So I'm glad things are at least holding on for all of you. Like Armando said, one of our main goals is to try to define what a PLC is, but that's really not the entire point of the webinar. I'm assuming if you're here with us today, you probably know at least the basics of a PLC if you're not actually engaged in a PLC process and are well versed. So we're not going to spend a lot of time sitting right here and defining what a PLC is, and we'll try to move past that and into how is it that we can really leverage potential Eduphoria tools or other just general best practices in engaging our teachers and our educators into an effective PLC process. So to begin, let's talk about PLCs being teachers engaged in collaborative problem solving, planning, and discussion. PLCs are focused on those 4 PLC questions, and PLCs are focused on student learning outcomes and results. So keeping that in mind, I have one more quick question. What comes out of your campus PLCs? I want you to take a moment to be vulnerable here. Yes, we are recording this webinar, but no, the answers in the chat aren't going to be shared with the recording. So take a moment to be honest and vulnerable. What comes out of your campus PLCs? Is it A, not a lot, but lots of conversation, but not a lot of action? Is it B, just a series of mini professional development opportunities? Is it C, teachers working collaboratively for student learning and using data? Or is it D, something else? And if you say something else, give me a couple of words that might describe it. Good. Really proud of what the teachers are doing. Got an A, got a B and C, an A and a C. Yes, different combinations of things happening. B or C, depending on the team. A and C, good. All right, I'm getting a variety of answers, so that's good. Too much RTI talk and not enough tier 1. That's good. Combination, but mostly C, that's good. So I think when we look at this, I think PLCs should potentially be a mixture of B and C and maybe D, depending on what it is you're doing, but more C than B. And A is one of those things we really need to try to address. And I think some of you hit it in the chat. It kind of depends on the group that you're working with, or even maybe the entire campus you're working with, if you're like from a district perspective. And culture is one of those really big pieces that drives how successful a PLC is or isn't. And we won't spend a lot of time talking about the culture, and instead we're going to be talking more about the logistics that can help make smoothing out something like the culture a little easier so the teachers can begin to get engaged and dived into the process. So if we go all the way back to the very beginning, to what Eduphoria actually said of what a PLC is, they defined it as an ongoing process in which educators work collaboratively in recurring cycles of collective inquiry and action research to achieve better results for the students that they serve. Notice the key words in this definition: ongoing, collective, inquiry. There are many, many challenges to making an effective PLC happen and for it to be the way that it should be. Often, if the correct culture is in place, again, if the correct culture is in place, then the number one barrier to an effective PLC is having readily available data that's easy to digest and easy to use to make action plans and make decisions. So much time is often devoted to looking up student results, putting it into something that makes it easier to digest, like an Excel spreadsheet, marking it up if necessary. Teachers and administrators, you guys are so busy as it is that doing that kind of thing often gets put into the back seat, and PLCs often just devolve into opportunities to get sidetracked by tasks rather than focusing on the inquiry. And so let's dive in a little bit more into how we can remedy some of that. When we reach a common definition of what a PLC is and how it should function, it's essential that you have that common definition across your campuses or even your entire district. It's more likely that you'll have those common expectations and cultures and agendas that really drive a good solid PLC that's focused on the 4 PLC questions and is rooted in student progress. Different approaches and definitions can lead to very inconsistent student outcomes. So if you go from PLC group to PLC group within the same campus, you'll often see different results based on little tiny differences in approaches, philosophies, because alignment may not have taken place. So let's read through some of these questions we have on the screen to really discuss how are you tackling that alignment? What conversations have occurred to actually align philosophy and approaches and expectations on your campus or in your district? How does your staff engage with or utilize instructional data? Do you have a common set of expectations? Is everyone doing it in similar ways? And have your teachers had an opportunity to actually practice being a PLC? I have seen many occasions where a campus will get a PLC process running. And as you guys know, getting an effective PLC going is often a multi-year process. And we see that spike upward in practice, and then it teeters off after 5, 6, 7 years and starts to decline because we have turnover on our campuses. When you have that turnover, when you have a successful PLC that's really running well, have you had your teachers been given an opportunity to practice it as you would expect students to potentially practice? And just something to help as you guys get a copy over the next couple of days of this particular presentation slide deck, we linked a couple of things that can really help you focus some learning and professional development through PLCs as a quick reorientation on how to get that PLC running. Sometimes that's often all it takes. It's just a quick reorientation and realignment. But more than that, and I'm going to hit on this a little bit deeper here in a minute, how are you leveraging a leadership position like a principal's role into the PLC process? We have a link there to an article that could be really helpful for you to really analyze and identify, as a campus leader, what am I doing within that PLC process that is either contributing or hindering the success of that PLC? Let's review quickly the 4 PLC questions. Each of these questions, you might go to a particular area in Eduphoria to actually find the answer to one of these questions. However, even in Eduphoria, it can take some time to build the exact data view that you're wanting, export it, create the visuals you need, etc. It's one of the greatest challenges, like I said before, and barriers to a high-functioning and efficient PLC. So when we're trying to actually answer these questions, these 4 questions need to continuously be the root. And if you're not finding the time and ability to answer the questions, and instead find yourself buried in tasks, how could we potentially leverage Aware and Strive to help streamline some of those processes so we can focus on the questions rather than the tasks? If we can focus on the questions, that's how we're going to really plug in and engage that PLC and engage the people that are participating in the PLC. If you're one of my district or campus administrators on this webinar today, stay tuned until the very end and we talk about the Strive component especially, that links back to the article I was mentioning just a minute ago about the principal's role in effective PLCs. So getting to what you need and effectively answer each of the 4 questions for every PLC actually takes time. And often it's time, like I said, teachers and administrators don't actually have. Deeper than that, it's worth actually asking if your PLCs are tied into functions that you're performing within Strive and giving opportunities to give feedback to those PLC teams through Strive. We're going to spend a little time talking about a relatively new tool, single test analysis. And near the end, like I said, we'll plug in that Strive aspect. Now, single test analysis may not be available to every single person, but if you don't have it, there are still really good practices we're going to pull out of this for things that you can start looking for in the data you may or may not be looking for now. So Aware offers single test analysis as the most accurate way to analyze student performance on an assessment. I'm going to go through some of the visuals to show you some examples here in just a few minutes and give you a brief overview of what single test analysis can do. But through that, we're going to dive into where some important data pieces, whether you have single test analysis or not, can be threaded to answer the 4 PLC questions, each one in different pieces, often combined in different pieces. Single test analysis can actually pull in and help disaggregate data by a lot of different layers, such as raw score, performance levels, student demographics, the learning standard, which are all things that quick views can do, but you'll see how single test analysis does it a little bit different. And the good question just to ask, have you ever wanted to look at how students answered those new interactive item types, the STAR 2.0 questions? Quick views can't let you do that. Single test analysis can. And leveraging single test analysis with those new item types can really help drive some of your PLC conversations in the way that you access data and start analyzing patterns of student answering. Before we dive into an example of single test analysis and what it has to offer, let's talk about depth of knowledge and how depth of knowledge plays a really pivotal role in all PLCs. Depth of knowledge becomes super important in determining mastery of student expectations. So when we look at it, a good example to think about is when we have a basic response to an essential question that might be at a DOK level 1. If the students are mastering at a DOK level 1, what if the test or the question is actually expected to be at DOK level 2? Can we effectively determine that students are mastering and actually answer that second PLC questions? How do we know if the students have gotten it? So there are a couple of reflection questions we have to ask ourselves. Have our assessments used questions that align in DOK with the standard? If not, then can we actually determine mastery? How will teachers know if and when they can determine mastery if DOK is missing as well? If you didn't get a chance, we have linked in this slideshow a webinar that we did with Eric Francis, who is from Solution Tree, who are the definitive resource on all things PLC. They invented the process. And within that, he goes really in depth for us on depth of knowledge and how to weave it into your instruction and assessment practices. So I highly encourage you to take a look at that here in just a minute. But I want to give you a really practical example of how DOK is really, really important in answering the second PLC question. If we look at a 4th grade science standard, 4.8b, it says to describe and illustrate the movement of water through the water cycle and explain the role of the sun as a major source of energy in the process. We have an interactive item, one of our hotspot items, but if we look at the question, it says, select the one hotspot that serves as an energy source for the water cycle. Hopefully they would select the sun that's boxed on the top left of the image. But when we really analyze that question, this question is at the identify stage or a depth of knowledge level 1. When we look at the verbs in the standard, describing and explaining are at DOK level 2. And so if I'm assessing with this particular question, students' mastery of the concept, is this a fair way for me to determine as whether I'm an instructional coach, administrator, or teacher, that the kids have actually mastered the standard? That's not to say that this is a bad question. It's fair to say that this question is a great scaffolded approach to determining mastery, but when we have that scaffolded approach, we have to make sure that we get to those top tiers of that scaffold to reach the standard or depth of knowledge level of the standard itself. So keep that in mind as you go through and think about that as you analyze the questions that you're actually assessing your students with. Now we're going to dive into an actual live introduction into single test analysis. We're going to go through getting started with single test analysis. All these slides will be available to you so you can use them for your own trainings if you see fit. I'm not going to spend a bunch of time on the slides themselves. I'm going to show you instead in a live demonstration, but we have 3 different ways of accessing or looking at data from an assessment: the performance summary, the learning standard summary, and the item response analysis. And when you dive into the item response analysis, here's an example of one of those questions and showing you kind of the answer spread and a different question with the TEI. And then we'll review last as we wrap up the live demonstration with which type of tests you can potentially use with single test analysis. So let's switch over to our example. I'm logged into a demo account here, so ignore some of the interesting names and year combinations you see down here. One of the things I want to highlight is when we're using single test analysis, the table here behaves just like the quick views table does. You have a rights level access at the top where you can toggle between analyze tests or other rights if you have them, or your class periods if you're a teacher. I have a year, grade, subject, and test type filter to help me narrow down into the test I'm looking for, or I can search by keyword. I do want to take just a second to highlight saved filters. If you use the save filter setting, I actually have 8th grade math set as a saved filter, and if I apply it, it will pre-apply 8th grade and math for me to help me narrow down. So if I'm like an 8th grade math teacher and that's all I'm really worried about, I can set those as a saved filter and help save myself some time in finding assessments. Now, the example I want to show you, back to STA, not a save filter, let's talk about this STA 8th grade example. This 8th grade math example shows a spread of students broken up by performance level that was tied to the assessment. This assessment has does not meet, approaches, meets, and masters. I can see at a glance, what are my kids doing or how are they doing in terms of general mastery at the like 60,000 foot level. I can make some immediate judgment calls that help me answer the second PLC question and potentially even the third. When I see right here that I had a raw score max of 20, but none of the kids that have tested have actually achieved 19 or 20, it might call into my mind, is there something about the instruction or is there something about the assessment that really needs to be drilled into? And so looking at this at a glance, I can get a really clear sense pretty quickly about where I need to direct my attention through that inquiry process. Below that, we have demographics. And if I were to drill down into a particular demographic, I'm going to scroll up just a little bit so you can kind of see how this changes. If I click the demographic, the graph actually changes and shows you just that demographic and how they did. So you can compare demographic to demographic, how the students are doing. To cancel that, I just click the same demographic again and I get back to all of my students. So you can see the performance summary really helps to give you that at a glance feel for how are my kids doing? Can I tell if they're getting it or not? And I can begin to dive just a little bit deeper. Let's look a little deeper at the learning standard summary. The learning standard summary, you'll notice something a little different. I have my standards all across the bottom on this particular assessment, but I also have depth of knowledge tied to each of my questions. If you're in a district that is not leveraging depth of knowledge on your assessment items already, you'll see more gray bubbles with no DOK. But I want to really encourage you, as we talked about in a previous part of the webinar, DOK is really, really critical to helping you decide, are the kids getting it? And if not, how am I going to respond? And if yes, how am I going to enrich? If I have no DOK, it's hard to know if, say, this particular standard right here, this 3, DOK 3 is actually pulling that average down quite a bit. And if I had no DOK, that bubble will be somewhere probably around in here. It might make me think that 8.5D is doing worse than it actually is, because 8.5D may be a standard that's actually at DOK 2. And if my kids are performing well at DOK 2, and I had a DOK 3 example, maybe it's something that needs to be taken into consideration when I'm analyzing the data in that way. Another example is 8.5A. All I have is DOK 3. So when I'm doing the analysis in my inquiry in my PLC, I can try to decide, well, is 8.5A actually really doing that poorly? Even though we're below a 50% average score of correctness, it doesn't look like it's doing well. But if 8.5A is actually at DOK 2, maybe it's a little better than I think. And I need to follow up with some spiral questions in my own instruction to get a better sense of how these kids are doing. And maybe I need to make a note on revising this particular assessment for next year. So I can start seeing at a pretty powerful glance how my kids are doing by DOK. Within this example, I can see my DOK 1 and 2s are all pretty dang high. There's one 8.3B that is a little lower than the rest. And so maybe at a glance, I can say, this is the standard we need to spend time this PLC discussing, because it is the one at DOK 2 that is the lowest compared to the others. This is where we're going to get the most bang for our buck, helping you answer that critical question number 2 and potentially even critical question number 3. Let's dive into item response analysis a little bit. This particular view is my favorite when it comes to PLCs because it breaks it down by individual item. I can see at a glance the percent of students that earned points by question. So I can see my correct, incorrect, or my multiple choice questions, while they make up the bulk of my test, I can actually maybe look at this as my first layer of analysis, and I can see Question 3 is something that is a little bit alarming, but it's 8.5D. What did I learn about 8.5D a second ago? 8.5D has a spread. And so I might need to actually look at this question and decide what is the DOK on it, and does what I'm seeing reflect what I know my kids are capable of doing. I come down here after clicking, I get a preview of the question with the answer spread right next to the question. I can see almost 70% of my kids picked B, the correct answer, but I had a relatively high percent picking C. This helps me see the misconceptions that my students are bringing to the table, which is a major piece of answering PLC question number 3 or PLC question number 4 if you're not seeing those distractors coming out and your performance is really, really high on particular questions. I can start threading out. I know my kids are missing something. What is that something? How is that distractor leading my kids to that misconception? And I can begin responding through those conversations with my PLC team on how am I instructionally going to address that particular shortcoming. Right here, your eyes all probably jump to number 11. What in the world is going on? It's way down here below 10%, and it's a partial credit type question. I can click on it, go actually see what this question is. It's a basic graphing, and really it just says, it's just an example question. So just keep that in mind as we're looking at this. But I can see within what I wanted my students to do as I hover over each of these interactions, it highlights it in the image as to which one I'm actually looking at. And I can see 30% of my kids picked that bottom left one, 0% picked that top left one, and 0 picked the middle one. What misconceptions are being drawn out of this, and how am I going to respond when my kids don't get it? I missed showing this just a second ago, but if you scroll down a little further, you get an individual student analysis, seeing student by student what it was that they actually literally answered and how many points they earned as a result of that particular answer. As you go through that, I'm not going to point out every single nuanced little thing, but you might want to play with some of the filter options like points earned and some of the responses and that sort of thing, filters. That gets really powerful if you take the time to actually play with it. And then I want to show number 13 just as a showcase for another item type, this one being drag and drop. 13 actually looks like it performed pretty well. It's a little bit above 80%. But if I'm looking at the actual item, I can see gap 1, which is this first one, only 56% of my kids got it. I might miss that in a standard analysis, thinking that the overall performance for the question might be good enough. I'm not worried about it. But because of this item response analysis, I can see gap 1 is a misconception. I have enough kids missing that particular gap that I should address that one instructionally with the entire group. Whereas gap 2 and gap 3, there's no misconception here. So maybe small groups is more appropriate for that one as well. Okay. That is single test analysis in a nutshell. Like I said, item response analysis is probably the most bang for your buck, where it really helps you answer questions 2, 3, and 4. And just as a quick note, I'm noticing there's a question or two in the Q&A. I promise I'll try to get to those here in just a minute. It's a little more difficult when you're running solo as a presenter. So patience, I will definitely get to them. All right, that's single test analysis. Let's talk about what's available within STA. You can link or look at within single test analysis any local assessment, whether that be like unit tests, local benchmark, campus assessments, your teacher and team tests, or even quick keys. The key to single test analysis is that the test must be linked to standards. Now note, STAR is not in this list, even though the questions are linked to standards, and that's because we don't actually have access to the questions for the most historical tests, at least not at this point. But if that should ever change, maybe STAR could be something we could add to STA in the future, but think local assessments for now. And then we can use and leverage this information on the right, including the raw score, percent score, the learning standards, and the depth of knowledge. Okay, that was a lot. We're going to pause and we're going to take a quick transition to a different topic. Remember, I promised those of you that were campus and PLC leaders, we talk a little bit about Strive and how Strive could be leveraged to assist with your PLC processes. So to get us going, I want to ask this particular question. Is your district currently leveraging PLCs as part of your teacher evaluations? A, yes, we are doing it right now. B, we're planning to beginning implementing it maybe next school year. No, we're not currently using PLCs for evaluations. Or D, we need to talk about this more as a district. Maybe it's an identified weakness. As answers are coming in, I'm seeing a bunch of C's and a few A's. Very good. Okay, so I think this next piece is going to be really beneficial for you. And I'm going to pause just for a second. Dana, I see your question. I'm going to click answer it live. Is there a way to see our school's results on a single test on a common assessment and not just the teacher's own data? If you're a campus or district administrator, yes, you can see that level of access. And you can filter it even by school. And once you've selected a school, you can filter it by instructor if you want to get that deep. I believe you can provide additional rights to someone like a department head that could see the aggregated data. If you'd like more assistance with setting something like that up, feel free to reach out to our support. All right, so back to Strive and how we're using it, or potentially not, when it comes to our PLC processes. This one's a quick answer as well. What is fair game for evaluation documentation? Specifically, I'm thinking t-tests. You may or may not be on t-tests, but most evaluations have at least common threads. What's fair game? Is it A, an actively being like lesson being taught? Is it B, students independently working? C, teachers collaborating to plan? Or D, all of the above? Type something in the chat just real fast. Good. Good. No one's fallen for this one. This one, no trap here. Yep, D's across the board. Good. Yes, it really is all of the above. But if we're being honest, which of the three do you tend to lack when it comes to your evaluation processes? I think most of us would agree it's probably C. The teacher's actually collaborating to plan and actually gathering evidence for those processes. So let's say hypothetically, you come into Strive and you see this overview. The overview is something we implemented not too terribly long ago, and I can see in the overview, I have 15 overdue tasks. With those 15 overdue tasks, I might be a little bit alarmed and think, oh my gosh, I'm way behind. What is it that I need to do? I click it, I start digging around a little bit. Out of the 15 overdue tasks, 10 of these are actually walkthroughs, I'm noticing. And hey, when I look at these names, I see 3 of those names are teachers that are actually in a PLC right this very second. Do you have something set up within your evaluation processes to go walk into that PLC, watch them talk, ask them questions if you need to, and then provide them feedback and link it to their evaluation in some way? I can tell you it might feel weird to do so, especially if you haven't oriented your staff to being familiar and used to that kind of thing. But once your staff is used to it, they'll become hungry for it. They want you to come and see them planning, because when it comes to PLCs, we're hitting domain 1 out of the park. When you conduct a walkthrough on a PLC, you can look at 1.2 planning, 1.3 knowledge of students, and 1.4 activities in completely different ways than you could with just leveraging something like the pre-evaluation conference. If I do just a pre-conference and rely on the lesson plans and that pre-evaluation conference for all of my domain 1 scores, I'm missing a really valuable component of me seeing my teachers execute planning and execute their knowledge of students in this PLC process through these conversations. So when I go through my PLCs, I need to have some sort of template that could be used for documenting that PLC. You have the ability to take one of the templates that's provided in the community examples of all of our t-test documentation that have been shared, or you could create one on your own that is really focused on domain 1 or has an entire section devoted to domain 1. If you look through a bunch of different districts' evaluation pieces that they've shared, whether it be for walkthroughs or otherwise, domain 1 is either a really tiny part or is entirely skipped over. If you add domain 1 pieces, even if it's as simple as checking an observed or needs to be observed column, it can give you valuable, at least occurrence or frequency data on how often these things are being hit for your teachers in conversation. You could get really even more in depth by adding, instead of just a check observed or needs to be observed, get down into some of the language involved with proficient and developing and accomplished and distinguished, so that you can give real feedback to your teachers. One of the flexible pieces we have within Strive you can create this walkthrough document and not tie it to the full eval process for the summative, and use it as just an informal way to give your teachers that feedback and give you some potential evidence that you could use for further coaching and further providing assistance to your staff members. In doing that, be really transparent with your staff and let them know, hey, this is a new thing we're going to try. And for the first couple of months, it's not even going to be tied to your t-test. We just want to practice it. I want to practice it. I want to practice it with you. I want to get feedback. I want to give you feedback. And then we get the opportunity to dive into our PLCs and look really, really carefully at 1.2, 1.3, and 1.4 with strict evidence. And then I get to check that walkthrough off the box. I can't tell you how many districts I've talked to that have the great intent of getting 5 or more walkthroughs done on their teachers, and they're lucky if they get in their classroom twice throughout the year. If I get to do walkthroughs on PLCs, I get to, in just a massive sweep, get 3 to 5 teachers in a PLC team in one walkthrough. How amazing would that be to help you feel like your evaluation list is just trickling down and getting a little more narrow? So definitely something to think about. That brings us near the end of our time together today. I want to wrap up with one more quick reflection question. After seeing this piece of Strive and the connection to PLCs, which of you now plan on trying to add PLCs to your evaluation workflow? A, definitely going to add it. B, I'm not quite sure yet. Or C, we're already doing it. Throw some answers in that chat for me. B's, lots of B's. Still not sure yet. I definitely understand your trepidation. If your campus, if your staff is not ready for it, doing it can cause more problems than not. So really carefully think about, if you're thinking about doing it, how am I going to execute it and get everyone on the same page? But I hope you saw the value in that the PLC process provides a wealth of information and evidence in areas of the rubric that can be difficult to gather. So something to think about and reflect on. All right, as a last note for myself, single test analysis is a part of Aware Premium only. And so if you are interested in what you saw and would like to get single test analysis, and if you're already not a premium customer, reach out to sales@eduphoria.net to get some more information. And I'm going to hand it back over to Armando to close us out.
Thank you, Jeremy. We are glad that this webinar has been able to provide you with some points to consider as you engage with your PLCs and analyze data. If you need additional assistance on this or for other topics, please email training@eduphoria.net. We want to remind you to visit our teacher learning site for Aware and Strive. We have created modules that consist of video and text learning resources and supports, in addition to knowledge checks and discussion prompts. The video content length ranges from a couple of minutes to about 6 minutes, where the teacher can get topic-specific demonstrations on utilizing Aware and Strive. Jeremy, thank you so much for hosting. On behalf of today's team and all of Eduphoria, we would like to thank you for joining us on today's webinar about data analysis. Engage your campus PLCs. Have a great day.
Thanks for joining us.